FOXPEN here, bringing you another episode of FOXPENMANSHIP. Today we're going to be fixing up that cider recipe that we made. The stream didn't go quite so well. That's alright, I'm new to the game. I'm not mad if you're not mad. I'm just going to show you how to do a really nice, basic, simple cider recipe. And all cider recipes are actually nice, basic, and simple. So follow along. I'm going to tell you what you need. I'm going to give you some recipe ingredient measurements, and let's get started. So what you're first going to need is, of course, a 1 gallon carboy. They're also called demijohns, fermenters, whatever. You're just going to need a gallon one for this recipe, nice and simple. You're going to need a beaker and a funnel. You're going to need an airlock and a bung, which is like a cork. You're going to need some sanitizer. You can use Star San, which is really common in the brewing world, or iodophor. They're both iodine based, so they're both pretty similar. Follow the instructions on the back appropriately. If you do it right, it should be non-rinse. If you do it right, it will not kill your yeast, nor will it poison you. Whenever you're using these, be sure to use cold water. Hot water will create toxic gases that can make you pretty sick, so just be sure you're using cold water. Put that there. I'm going to use Star San because it's really nice, simple to come by. So Star San, you need 1 ounce per 5 gallons. Now we're only using 1 gallon, so we're going to use 1/5 of an ounce, 5 milliliters. Nice and simple. I just so happen to have this little eyedropper here. When it's full, that's 1 milliliter. So we're going to be using 5 of those. Let it make contact for, if it's the first time you've ever used anything, 2 minutes. After that, you can use it for a little less time, but I like to just give it 2 minutes so it kills off any bacteria or live cultures and bad stuff that's just in your equipment beforehand. You're going to use sugar. I'm using 2 cups of white and brown sugar, 1 cup of each. And I've also grated just a teeny tiny little bit of nutmeg in there. I'm going to see how flavoring during primary fermentation actually affects my brew. Bit of an experiment. Usually you flavor during secondary fermentation, but whatever. We're going to try it. You're going to need apple juice, of course. Use an apple juice that you like to drink. That's nice and tasty. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with a cider that isn't tasty to you. I use Allen's. It's Canadian, and it's cheap, 99 cents a liter. Can't beat that. You have to make sure that you're using one that has no preservatives in it, and that includes phosphates. They will kill your yeast, and you won't wind up with cider. You will wind up with red-flavored apple juice that is not pleasant. So make sure you're using a preservative-free apple juice. That's very important. You're going to need a teaspoon measuring cup, and you're going to need yeast. I'm using Red Star Premier Blanc champagne yeast. This is going to create a very dry cider. This is a very high ABV. That's alcohol percentage basically. It's a very high ABV yeast. It can survive up to, I believe it is 15, 16, maybe as high as 18%. Make sure you know the percentage of your yeast, how tolerant it is. Cider is typically around the 4 to 6% mark. If you're getting into mead, I definitely recommend this one because mead is a lot higher. Wine is also typically around the 11 to 16%. Use a nice, good, reliable brand of yeast. You don't have to use brewer's yeast. You can use baker's yeast if that's what you have. Yeast is yeast. The only difference is baker's yeast produces a lot of oxygen to raise bread, and brewer's yeast produces a lot of alcohol. Look at that there. Some optional ingredients. This is Yeast Nutrient. What this is it's like giving a little energy boost to your yeast. You're going to use a half a teaspoon total for the recipe. You're going to start with a 1/4 teaspoon now, and then in 5 days you're going to add another 1/4 teaspoon. You don't want to overload the brew at first because it's like giving kids candy. If you give them too much, they're going to be bouncing off the walls. You don't want to do that. You just want to give it a little treat to motivate it. Another optional ingredient, this is Pectic enzyme. This is a clarifier. You don't have to use this. You don't even have to use the yeast nutrient. Most store-bought apple juices are clarified anyway. If you're using farm cider, or if you press your own apples, you're blessed to have an apple press. You even have a couple apple trees on your property. I don't know. I wish I did, but I don't. If you have something like that, you'll want to use Pectic enzyme. What it does is it just makes your brew nice and clear. Now, the thing with cider and most homebrew, time cures everything. You don't need it because after time, depending on how long you age your cider, it's going to clarify anyway. I like a nice quick cider. I want to be drinking it within 2-3 months, especially now that it's summer. It's nice cold brew, sitting on patio. Just, yeah, it makes it nice and pretty a little bit faster. You're going to need a bucket for sanitization. Pour your nice sanitized water in there. Halloween theme optional, that's just how I roll. And you're going to need water. I do not recommend you use tap water. I recommend you use distilled water. I'm lucky to live in a place where water is relatively affordable. It's actually very affordable. 2 gallons of distilled water for me costs $1. I'm spoiled. If you use tap water, it will affect the flavor. And if you happen to have water where, in order to make it potable, there's fluoride or chlorine or other chemicals in there, you might pick up those flavors in your cider. Also, you don't know what kind of bacteria lurks within your piping system. If you're in an apartment or a home, it doesn't matter. I just recommend you use distilled water. You don't have to. If you happen to have a Brita filter or something like that, go for it. It'll at least take out a little bit of the taste. It'll also take out some of the bacteria that can come with tap water. Alright, so let's get started. Now, this gallon, as you can see by the distortion, this carboy is already full of water, so we're going to sanitize it. 1, 2, 3, 4, just short of 5. 5. Look at that amber color, very nice. If you have a lid, go ahead and use it. I'm just going to put my hand on this. Give it a swirl. I'm going to put it so it's out of the way. Sugar, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. You don't have to use sugar if you want. You don't have to use half white sugar, half brown sugar. Usually I use white sugar. I just happened to have brewed about 7 gallons of beer recently and I'm out of white sugar, so I'm using brown. The sugar you use will affect the flavor. Brown sugar will give it a really nice kind of caramel flavor. White sugar will just be like a nice sweet flavor. If you use maple syrup, you'll get a little bit of a maple flavor. If you use honey, you'll get what you call a cider, which is a combination of mead and apple cider. It's really quite tasty actually. If you can afford the honey, try it. If not, plain old white sugar will do. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so I actually already sanitized this. I'm just showing you how to sanitize it because it's super nice. What we're going to do is we're going to pour it into our bucket so we can sanitize everything else. When you pour it, you're going to see, that's not quite so amber anymore because it's had time to do its thing. It's also going to smell sterile. Pour it low so you don't get a lot of splatter. It's just common knowledge that isn't really that common. I'm going to put this back down here. I'm going to take my beaker, my funnel, my airlock, and my bung, and our teaspoon. I'm going to put everything in there. Make sure you disassemble your airlock. Mine comes in 3 pieces, the main body, the air stopper, and then the lid. These are really great. What you do is you just pour sanitizer in right up to the line there. Make sure this is in there before you do that. And then you pop the lid on. You'll stick it in the bung, which will cork up this demijohn. And what this does is it's going to let air out, but it's going to stop air from getting in, as well as other bacteria, and fruit flies, which sometimes if you don't use one of these, you may have a problem. You don't want to expose this to air, because then you'll get a whole gallon of sweet apple cider vinegar. Oxidization is bad for alcohol. Okay, so because star sand is no rinse and we measured it properly, don't rinse it, just make sure it's as dry as possible. Oh yeah, don't forget to sanitize your hydrometer. Be very careful with this, it's glass. It's very important if you want to know your ABV percentage. I'd like to know that. Don't stir with it, don't drop it, don't put it in hot water. Don't put hot water in your carboy either. This is not Pyrex, it's just plain old glass. It'll shatter if you put boiling water in there. Some people take that risk. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't want glass exploding in my face, so this is how I do. Okay, so give that all a nice big old stir. For me, this stuff is specific brewing equipment, so I know it's sanitized, but it's good practice to just do it before and after. That way, not only is it becoming habitual, but you know where your stuff has been and you know it's clean. Particularly need the distilled water. I mean, we're just using it for cleaning, but I did introduce the water because if you're making something like wine, you're going to want to use that nice distilled water. I mentioned I brewed beer. I use distilled water. I don't want to use tap water. I make a lot of berry wines. I have a batch of strawberry fizz on the go right now. That's distilled water. So that's just a little bit of trivia for anyone that wants to start experimenting. For cider, you're using apple juice. You don't need the water except for cleaning, and in which case tap water is okay. So I don't want to confuse anyone, but it is just a little interesting fact that when you're brewing, try to use distilled water. For cider, it's okay. So what we're gonna do for your apple juice, I might cut this. Now you can warm the apple juice and dissolve your sugar in hot apple juice. That's quicker. But you have to wait till it cools down to room temperature, a little bit lower than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, you pour hot apple juice into your demijohn, you're gonna explode it. And if it doesn't explode and you think all is good, you pitch your yeast, you're actually going to cook your yeast and it will not activate. So, we'll keep going. So 1 gallon of apple juice is 4 liters, just over. That's 2 liters down. Yeah. Pour your sugar in there. So Foxy, oops, don't spill it. I just spilled quite a bit there. But Foxy, it's sticking to my funnel. That's okay, we got apple juice we're still going to pour in there and we're going to wash it all out. Carefully pour your sugar in there. I lost a half a teaspoon, that's okay. Yeah, what? Now what we're going to do is we're going to swoosh this around and we're going to dissolve the sugar. If you have a cap, most carboys will come with a cap. Make sure you sanitize your cap, screw it on there. This is only half full. I'm just going to swirl it. Takes about 2 minutes on average. Check it. Looks more like farm cider now, doesn't it? Ooh. That ought to do it. You can see it's starting to clarify a little bit. Okay, now we can add the rest of our apple juice. Wash all the sugar that's stuck in the funnel out. Going to take a minute, make sure my audio is still recording. Which it is. Good. Sanitize your hands. Now you're going to want to go to the shoulder of the carboy. If you go higher than that, you run the risk of foamy mouth. So once you pitch the yeast, you're going to notice after a day or two that it's going to start foaming. And if you filled it too much, it's going to come through your airlock and make a mess on the floor. That's all. This is a nice safe distance volume right here, rather. Take a teaspoon, give it a shake, shaker. Don't use a tea towel to dry it. Then it's not sanitary anymore. Well, not sanitized. I can eyeball this. I don't know if you can. So a quarter teaspoon of the yeast nutrients. Quarter teaspoon of your pectic enzyme. I'll pour this over here, powder and all make a mess. Don't need that anymore. Give it a little swoosh. Just mix it in there. Alright, now you're ready to pitch your yeast. Most yeast packets are 5 grams. You only need a gram per carboy. If you're using like a 5-gallon carboy, obviously just dump the whole package in there. It doesn't matter if you go over on your yeast measurement. Better too much than too little when it comes to this. I actually tend to use half a pack per brew. That's a really safe bet. So what I'm going to do is about 3 grams in that, if memory serves. Yeah. I'm going to use 2 grams. And again, I can eyeball it. I've done this plenty of times. If you want to weigh it, by all means weigh it. Or just use half a pack. It's perfectly fine to do that. Now, pitching your yeast literally just means you're pitching your yeast. You're going to pour it right on top, and that is that. Your cider is done. You just got to cork it up and then airlock it. Make a label. You're good to go. You can mix it up. I've never had any adverse effects by giving the brew a little swish up. But this is how it's supposed to be done. It's one of those things. It doesn't need to be done this way, but it's just how you do it. There you go. Yeast is on top. You can see. There it goes. Forgot to take our hydrometer reading. Alright, so whether you take the hydrometer reading before or after you pitch the yeast shouldn't have any effect. The only adverse thing to doing it after the yeast is your wine thief might pick up some of the yeast and it might clump to it. Oops. I'm wondering what I had that beaker up there for, eh? Okay. We're going to take our wine thief. You don't need this. It's just now that I've pitched the yeast, I really don't want to mess with it too much. Before you pitch the yeast, just pour a little bit of your sugared apple juice into your beaker. Now my yeast is falling. I'm actually just going to give it a little bit of time to fall so I get less clumping. It's not too bad actually. And I'm going to carefully fill my beaker. Foxy's a really bad teacher. And of course you're going to sanitize your wine thief if you do what Foxy did and forget to take the reading. Sanitize everything. Always sanitize everything. You cannot have too much sanitization. You can have too much sanitizer. You'll know because you'll feel sick and your yeast won't work. Let it out, let it drip. Turn. And then into the sanitizer. That should be enough. If you need a little more, that's fine. Take your hydrometer, and move the soda a little bit. There we go. Take your hydrometer, put it in, give it a spin to help keep it off the edges. Look how buoyant it is. Nice and cool. When you look at your hydrometer, if you have the same one I do, it's going to have 3 readings on it. I use the .999 reading. This is just the easy scale for me. And this, oh sweet. It's 13. I'm at .950. That's pretty good. I'm going to double check my notes from previous ciders where I was at 1.45. That's not bad either, actually. If you have something less than 1.050, 050 rather, there's not enough sugar. Add another half cup of sugar. Sorry, 1.050, not 1.950. That makes no sense. This is 1.050. So it's just basically right where it needs to be. This is good. Pitching the yeast and then doing this doesn't make a difference. It's just easier to do it and then pitch the yeast. Pour it back in. Be gentle. At this point, now that the yeast is in there, you don't want to add oxygen into it. Remember what I said about how oxidization makes you really sweet vinegar? Into the sanitizer. Bung. This has to be dry when you put it in. I'm actually just going to perch it right there. If it's wet, the bung will come up and then air can get in. You don't want that. Take your airlock. If you have, this is a single chamber. I also have double chamber ones that show you negative and positive pressure. They're really fun. Just whatever, they're all going to have that line that needs to be filled with sanitizer. So pop in the stopper. Not enough. Not enough. On the nose. Cap it. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it. Gotta get it dry. Work on your dance moves. I do the finger dance. I'm so cool. Good. Push the bung in. Watch it. Make sure it's not coming up on you. This is fine. Take your airlock. Your bung should be drilled. If you didn't buy a drilled bung, you're just going to have to drill the hole yourself. You'll have to see, depending on your drill kit, what the gauge is, what drill you'll need. Just buy yourself a tap bung. It's so much easier. Line them up, push it in. There you go. Redwall Abbey cider. Now, the next step is really, really crucial. You have to listen very carefully to what I'm going to say. Take the cider, put it in a room temperature, dark area, and leave it there for at least 2 weeks without thinking about it whatsoever. What you're going to do, actually, that's not entirely true. In the next 2 days, for the next 2 days, you're going to come back and you're going to check. You want to see a little frothing on the headline of your cider, and you're going to want to see a little bit of bubbling in your airlock. That's the air actually leaving as the yeast eats up all the sugars and farts out air. The air is going to come up, this is going to bubble, and you might even notice a nice kind of smell to the area around where you're leaving this to ferment. You know what, I should put a little more apple juice in there. Careful, cause I don't. Yeah. Now Fox is satisfied. Record in the book what your OG is. So 1.050. Record the measurements. For this recipe, I use 3.5 liters of Allen's apple juice, 1/4 teaspoon Pectic enzyme, 1/4 teaspoon yeast nutrient. In 5 days, I'm going to add the other 1/4 teaspoon of the yeast nutrient. I used 2 grams of yeast, and I used 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup white, 1 cup brown. And yeah, you want to write the date down, obviously. This is June 23rd. Add yeast nutrients. June 28th. And when you think everything's done fermenting, you might notice there's not a lot of activity or no activity whatsoever going on in your airlock. Then we can get into secondary fermentation. You'll need your hydrometer for that, and you're also going to need an online calculator, and that's how you're going to calculate your ABV. When you're thinking this is done fermenting, I want you to take hydrometer readings every other day, 3 times, at least. If the ABV, if the OG reading is the exact same for those 3 measurements that you've taken every other day, you know for a fact this is done fermenting. If you don't have a hydrometer and you don't want to spend the 20 bucks that it takes to buy one, give this 2 to 3 weeks, a month to be perfectly safe. By then, cider's really typically done primary fermentation. And that's it. That's primary fermentation of cider. I'll see you for secondary cider in 2 weeks to a month. Bye now.